In this lesson, we will apply function notation. Function notation is when instead of a y, we have an f of x, like we do here. So this is a function f of x, meaning it's defined in relationship to x, meaning that whatever I plug in for x will change the output. So here, if they're saying find f of -2, it's the same as them giving me this equation and then saying find y when x equals -2. It's essentially the exact same question. So what that tells me to do is to rewrite my equation, and everywhere I see x, I replace it with -2 in parentheses, just like that. And then of course it's just a matter of doing the math. -2 squared is 4, 3 times 4 is 12. 2 times -2 is -4, but I'm subtracting a -4, which means I'm actually adding 4. And then, of course, plus 4. So 12 plus 4 is 16, plus 4 is 20. So f of -2 is 20. What that tells me is if I were to graph that, -2, 20 would be a point on that parabola. Looking at my next one, f of n, means every time I see an x, I replace it with an n instead. And just get used to plugging them in parentheses. Now I'm just going to do some simplification. What's n squared? I don't know, it's n squared. What's -2 times n? -2n. So that would be as far as I could go because I don't have a value for n. F of the square root of 3, or f of radical 3, means I'm plugging in radical 3 in parentheses anytime I see an x. Then I'll simplify. Radical 3 squared is 3. 3 times 3 is 9. 2 times radical 3, I can't do anything about that because I don't want to turn that into a decimal. And then I have plus 4. I've got two real numbers, 9 and 4, which I can add together to get 13. And then just keep the other one there. So 13 plus 2 radical 3. Sorry, 13 minus 2 radical 3. Last one, a little bit complicated. I'm going to move it up here so that we have room. It's saying replace, every time you see an x, replace it with x minus 3 instead. So this one's going to take a little bit of work, and that's okay. Now notice I'm actually plugging an x back in, and when I plug that x back in, that means I'm not going to end up with an answer like 20. I'm going to end up with an answer that's a little bit ugly like we did for part B. This means I'm going to take x minus 3 times x minus 3. I'm going to FOIL that out. So that's x squared minus 6x plus 9. I'm going to distribute that minus 2. And then I still have my plus 4. I've got this 3 on the outside of all of this, so I'm going to distribute the 3. 3x squared minus 18x plus 27. And then rewrite, minus 2x plus 6 and plus 4. And then write my solution in standard form. So I'm going to write my 3x squared first. I've got a minus 18x and a minus 2x, which combine to minus 20x. And then I have a plus 27 and a plus 6, which is plus 33, plus 4, which is plus 37. So that would be as simplified as I can get that question. Evaluating a square root function for these values. This one says 5 minus 3 times 1, which would be 5 minus 3, or 2. So my answer is just radical 2. For my next one, 5 minus 3 times -5 means that it's actually 5 plus 15, which is radical 20. Radical 20 would reduce. Again, breaking it into parts would be 4 and 5, which means 2 radical 5. If I plug in 3, then I get 5 minus 9, which of course is -4. The square root of negative 4 is plus or minus 2i. Alex might just have you write that as no solution or no real solution. Last one, 3w, would be 5 minus 3 times 3w, which would be the square root of 5 minus 9w. Not a darn thing I can do about that, so that's as simplified as it gets. For this last question, go ahead and try it on your own and then press play to check your work. Again, I've got the function f of x. Every time I see x, I replace it with whatever they ask me to replace it with, and then do whatever simplification I can. So in this case, I've replaced x with x plus 2. For my first example, that means, of course, I'm going to have to FOIL this out, because this is actually x plus 2 times x plus 2. FOILed out, that would be x squared plus 4x plus 4. And then I would take my minus 2 times x, so that's minus 2x, and my minus 2 times 2, so that's minus 4. And then I will simplify anything I can. I've got my x squared first. I've got plus 4x and minus 2x. Those combine together to plus 2x. And then I've got plus 4 and minus 4, and those two cancel. So this is my final answer, x squared plus 2x. The last one, I have 5 squared minus 2 times 5. 5 squared is 25, minus 2 times 5 is 10, so my solution is 15.